Okay. Welcome to Melly, both for those who are in the room with us, as well as our online audiences who are joining us either today or at a later date via our website or YouTube or on Facebook. We're here at the moment in the Melly Bookshop and Cantina of Kunstinstitut Melly. My name's Vivian Zahol. I'm the Research and Program Manager. And tonight we're here to mark the launch of Culture Strike, Art and Museums in an Age of Protest, written by Lara Raicovich, who we're extremely delighted to have with us here in person tonight, joining us from the United States on her first international travel in quite a long while. And not only that, but it's the first time that Lara has been able to talk about this book with a live public as well. So it's a special moment. Just with a few words of introduction for us here at Kunstinstitut Melly, this marks the second book launch in 2 weeks. Just this time last week, we were launching Vistas of Modernity by Rolando Vazquez, together with the Mondrian Fund. And with that, we hosted a keynote by Professor Gloria Wecker. And these two sit in a very strong dialogue. Last week we were talking about the relationship between intersexual feminism and decoloniality and what it means for institutions to transform. And with today's program, we continue that conversation on transformation by really getting into some nitty-gritty case studies of institutions in crisis, specifically in the United States, but also with a lot of significance for movements underway here in the Netherlands. The book really delves through case examples that really bring up this great paradox. How can we have institutions that are financially dependent upon capital and the state, but that are somehow not symmetrical to capital and the state in their social makeup? A big question, and I look forward to delving into it. So tonight's program will feature a reading by Lara from the book, and it will be followed by a conversation. As much as the book offers a far-reaching analysis of cultural institutions, it's also a very personal book. And it stems from Lara's experience, specifically as a director of the Queen's Museum from 2015 to 2018, and we'll definitely hear a lot more about that shortly. For further introduction, Lara is a New York-based writer and curator who recently served as interim director of the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art. She was a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow at the Bellagio Center, was awarded the inaugural Emily H. Tremaine Journalism Fellowship for Curators at Hyperallergic. While at the Queen's Museum, she co-curated Mel Chin all over the place. And Lara is no stranger to the Netherlands. We're delighted to welcome her back, and we must know that she was a close collaborator with Rotterdam artist Jennifer Heeswijk in her trainings for the Not Yet, which was held at BAC last year, and we're really delighted to have both Gianna as well as the BAC director, Maria Hlebogeva, with us tonight. We're honored by your presence. So without further ado, Lara, would you please welcome us with a reading from your book?
Absolutely. So first of all, I just want to say thank you, because this is a rare treat, given the last 18 months that we've all been living through, hopefully in solidarity with one another, hopefully supporting and caring for one another to the extent possible. And thank you for being here. Thank you to Melly, particularly to Vivian, for doing all of the craziness to get me here physically, and to Sophia for the gracious hosting and invitation, because without you all, I would not be standing here, and instead would be seeing you all through the screen. It was a real, I won't say it was entirely without anxiety, but it was a real pleasure to get back on an airplane and to land in Rotterdam, to land in the Netherlands, to a rather empty airport, to get on a train, and to be here physically in the city, to be here with all of you. I think one of the things that I missed the most in this last 18 months was sharing space and being physically present with friends and comrades and thinkers alike. So I thought what I would do is read a portion of the introduction, which gives a good sense of why I've written this book and from where I come, maybe intellectually a little bit as well as experientially, and then to read from a chapter that's called The Neutrality Problem, which gets at the core of, I think, what some of the issues that culture faces at the moment. So, we are living in an age of protest. Around the globe, radical movements from prison and debt abolition to Extinction Rebellion's climate activism have penetrated mainstream discourse. Culture and art have necessarily also come under fire. While art has enormous potential to shift society, the institutions upon which it relies to help hold systems of power in place. As much as I love museums and have dedicated my career to them, they are repositories of cultural hegemony, mirrors of society's ills. From enormous wealth gaps and other legacies of colonialism to the exclusion of historically marginalized groups, museums and cultural spaces are part of the systems that protests hope to undo. I believe this undoing and redoing can not only make museums better for more people, but also map ways to make change in society at large. My most recent experiences at the Queen's Museum as the director, by turns exhilarating, challenging to my core, and heartbreaking, are central to this thinking. I led the museum for 3 extraordinary years through moments that proved to be high points of my professional life and others that threatened to thwart my deeply held convictions of art and culture's vital engagement in societal change. A public museum, the Queen's Museum is situated within a public park in one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse geographies on the planet. It is in a city of immigrants. Queens is host to New York City's 2 major airports. It is the place most newcomers arrive. Many stay in the string of neighborhoods along the 7 train, the borough's spine, which transports a population that speaks over 138 different languages and dialects. Each subway stop opens doors into different cultures, and yet we're all New Yorkers. In awe of these realities, I took up my post at the Queen's Museum in January 2015. Just 18 months later, the election of Donald Trump would dramatically shift the landscape in which I worked. While the museum remained on an upward trajectory of increased attention, support, and visibility, the results of the election deeply impacted the staff and our publics, as well as our collaborators surrounding the museum. Over a decade before I arrived at the Queen's Museum, community organizers have been hired in a brilliant move to connect with nearby immigrant communities. Led initially by Jay Sri Abichandani and then by Prerna Reddy, this organizing effort created a new model for how museums could engage their publics. The goal was not just to bring people to the museum, but rather to leverage the museum's own resources to surface and enact the desires of the community via cultural cultural organizing. In the aftermath of the election on November 8th, 2016, the Trump administration's policies and rhetoric unleashed a Pandora's box of hate. And one of its primary targets was immigrants. At this museum, these new conditions were no mere abstraction, but an all too harsh reality. 5% of the Queen's Museum staff received the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, protections. President Obama's executive order that provided legal status to many people brought to the United States without documentation as children. This group heard Donald Trump's promises to repeal DACA, without which they would risk losing temporary relief from legal uncertainty or even face deportation to countries they had never visited. Further, in the weeks following the election, many of the people with whom the museum staff had collaborated for more than a decade and a half through free family programs, the New Yorkers art classes taught in over a dozen different languages, gatherings and classes at Immigrant Movement International in Corona, Queens, along with other long-term partnerships, these people now feared leaving their homes and even sending their children to school. Whether or not the participants in these programs possessed documentation, there was worry about being caught up in a raid, an ICE raid, or of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I started getting Facebook alerts from various local groups spreading news of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, being at one or another subway stop, or heading to a specific neighborhood nearby. Some even claimed that the alerts themselves were fake, sent out on social media to stir anxiety and fear amongst immigrant populations. City council members planned special sessions to reassure their constituents. The New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio convened a town hall in Corona, which is the neighborhood adjacent to where the museum is located, and with council member Julissa Ferreras Copeland, along with a cadre of city agency heads and local uniformed police, in an attempt to reassure immigrants that we are all New Yorkers, no matter their immigration status, and that local police forces and the educational system should be seen as allies, as opposed to the federal government's ICE contingent. In this climate at the museum, we started holding weekly all-staff meetings. We contacted immigrant rights groups to be sure to stay updated on any changes in policy, whether local or national, and shared this information with our networks. We coordinated with city agencies to be sure our staff and publics could access important information about their rights. We assembled a list of the museum's resources that could be lent to local groups, and we decided to join the art strike called for Inauguration Day in January. So on January 20th, 2017, while the Queens Museum was closed to regular operations, the staff created a program that invited the public to work with a printmaking collective on creating posters, buttons, and other ephemera for the upcoming protests. Over 300 people gathered in the atrium that day. I was deeply moved by this gathering of retired school teachers, artists, students, local moms, grandmas. Throughout the day, several in attendance thanked us for creating a space to gather on a day they felt so vulnerable. On that rainy day, it never would have crossed my mind that just over a year later, I would resign my post. What happened over the following 12 months would prove immensely complex. Several trustees did not like the fact that we were joining the Inauguration Day strike. Their position was that we should continue to do the work we had always done, but do it quietly. At least one trustee expressed fear of retribution from Trump via punitive tax audits of specific board members. From my perspective, not only had the political environment created a predicament in managing a staff with a significant number of increasingly precarious immigrants, but I also felt strongly that we needed to be forthright and direct in our support for communities with whom we had built a great deal over the years. Trust was at issue. The staff and I drafted a restatement of our values in a Google Doc, which we felt would be important to buttress our work. This took the form of a letter from the director that we posted to the museum's website. I presented the values statement at the next board meeting where it was unanimously approved. This statement, since removed from the website, included the following. The Queens Museum asserts a deep commitment to freedom of expression and intentionally supports and celebrates difference and multiplicity as fundamental to our collective liberation. We believe that art can shift the ways in which we experience our world, and therefore art, artists, and cultural institutions have a powerful role to play in society. Therefore, the Queens Museum advocates for art as a tool of positive social change, critical thinking, discussion, debate, discovery, imagination, and in order to make visible multiple histories and realities. 2, supports and initiates projects and programs that are inspired by actively listening to the needs and aspirations of the communities we serve and consider to be our valued partners. 3, works to engender respect for a diversity of cultures, broaden access to ideas and art, and connect the public to opportunities for civic agency. And 4, uses our resources, human, financial, environmental, and beyond, to engender greater equity, inclusiveness, sustainability, both within our institution and the broader society. Outside the Queens Museum, Artists, art workers, curators, professors, and others started organizing with, as one Google group's name made clear, a sense of emergency. Around this time, New York's Museum of Modern Art installed an exhibition of work from their collection by artists who would no longer be welcomed to the United States due to the Trump administration's so-called Muslim ban. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum submitted amicus briefs to the Supreme Court to overturn this ban, which were co-signed by the Association of Art Museum Directors, the American Association of Museums, and more than 100 small museums all over the United States. Smaller organizations were doing whatever they could. From the sense of emergency cohort, a new working group formed, calling ourselves Art Space Sanctuary. This group was headed by Abu Farman, an artist and professor of anthropology at the New School, as well as a dedicated immigration rights activist. We looked to the sanctuary movement of the 1980s in Latin America, largely carried out by clergy members committed to liberation theology and using churches to shelter people fleeing violence, and the new sanctuary movement of the 2000s, spearheaded by a group of interfaith leaders in the United States seeking justice for migrants and immigrants. We thought that Art Space Sanctuary could communicate that cultural spaces were for everyone, and that within these spaces there could be ways of conveying care and support. The Queens Museum had a long history of collaboration with frontline organizations, including the immigrant advocacy group Make the Road, an addiction support group called Drogadictos Anónimos, and among many others. The idea was to create a series of protocols that would allow museums and cultural spaces to make connections between audiences and these organizations so that we could support vulnerable populations. I strongly believe that the Queens Museum would make an ideal organization to embrace this concept, given our long-term relationships and the extant programming of the museum. We hope to gather a critical mass of cultural organizations that would become art space sanctuaries by agreeing to the guidelines Farman had developed and made public on his website. This, we hoped, would signal the cultural sector's support for the vulnerable people who worked in the museum, as well as those who visited. The guidelines were flexible, and given that the Queens Museum already had relationships with many frontline groups, it made sense for us to sign on. Buoyed by the enthusiastic support of a few trustees, I presented it at our next board meeting. The response was profoundly disappointing. A handful of board members thought the idea completely untenable, expressing fears that the notion of cultural sanctuary would turn the museum into a place for people to hide out and sleep. A fundamental misunderstanding of the concept. With outspoken opposition to the initiative, it was impossible to move it forward. Moreover, the rhetoric of the rejection was grounded in the notion that as a public institution, we should not, indeed could not, take sides in the political debate surrounding immigration. We had to repudiate a pro-immigrant initiative like Art Space Sanctuary in order to maintain a supposedly neutral position. It was not only demoralizing, but it was wrong. The situation was further complicated in June 2017 when the mission of Israel to the United Nations contacted the museum about renting the galleries to hold an anniversary event for the historic vote that paved the way for the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. You see, the Queens Museum's physical building was an appealing location for the event because it was where the UN General Assembly met from 1946 to 1950, prior to the museum's existence. Their proposal was to reenact the vote that took place on November 27, 1947. Then Vice President Mike Pence was to be the keynote speaker, addressing hundreds of invited guests. I felt obviously deeply uncomfortable with this space rental proposal. Typically, rentals of the museum were for weddings or bar mitzvahs or other types of celebrations. This was a very different kind of event. Not only was I gravely concerned about the operational impacts of an event of this scale, imagine Mossad and the CIA or whoever would have to come to plan an event like this. But the mission's confirmation of the Vice President of the United States' attendance made more than 4 months in advance strongly suggested that there was a political core of the event that was not being fully disclosed. With government sponsorship and the roster of politicians speaking and attending, I believe this was an event engineered to support the views of particular and very specific government aims, and that this violated what had been a long-standing practice of not renting the space for political events. Recognizing the unique character of the proposed rental, especially in the context of the United States and New York, I escalated the conversation to the board for consideration. I recommended against holding the event, but the decision was ultimately up to the trustees. After much debate, the board decided to decline the mission of Israel's proposed event. 2 days later, an article appeared in the Jerusalem Post stating that I, as the museum's director, was anti-Israel because I edited a book about cultural resistance that contained a section about BDS, the movement inspired by Palestinian civil society's call to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel. The article was highly critical of me for my supposed canceling of the event. A New York City Council member called for my dismissal and started seeking support for a petition, and the New York Post piled on with additional criticism. The board then reacted with great speed, reinstating the event it had rejected only a few days earlier. No public statement corrected the misperception that the initial decision was mine. I found myself under an avalanche of hate for alleged anti-Semitism. I was even forced to publicly speak about the fact that my husband is in fact Jewish and that my son had a bris. It was unbelievable. I found myself under this avalanche of hate for alleged anti-Semitism. In the aftermath of these articles, I felt I had to prove to board members, never mind the online universe that was now propelling vitriol at a staggering speed towards me, that I was indeed not an anti-Semite. My Jewish husband counseled me to talk publicly about his family's history, to relay that his grandparents were Auschwitz survivors and that our son had a bris, and that my grandmother helped Jewish men escape across the border in fascist Italy during the Second World War. It felt truly horrible to trot out these facts about my existence in an effort to convince people who had known me for years that I didn't hate people for what their cultural or religious backgrounds were. Meanwhile, the work of the Queen's Museum was garnering broader acknowledgement by the public and completely independent, seemingly, of this kerfuffle. It was particularly encouraging when the New York Times profiled my work at the museum. We had just opened a series of successful exhibitions, among them Never Built New York, which featured an array of architectural projects planned but never realized that made unique use of the panorama, a 10,000 square foot model of every single building in New York City's 5 boroughs that is the centerpiece of the museum's collection. I was also deep into planning a major exhibition of artist Mel Chin's work, which I would co-curate with Men on Sloan and the nonprofit arts organization No Longer Empty, that would fill the entire museum with major projects that would spill into various public sites throughout New York City. Additionally, we had recently received significant grants from very prestigious foundations. With these promising fundraising results, we had achieved a financial milestone toward which I had been working since my first days at the museum. There was an enormous amount to be proud of. Nonetheless, as fall unfurled and the mission of Israel's event took place at the museum, the politics of this event became clearer. At the November 28th event, Pence delivered his speech as planned, which went far beyond the celebration of Israel's anniversary. It turned out to be a 45-minute-long policy speech previewing the Trump administration's intent to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Trump made his public announcement of the move from the White House just a week later, and in the days that followed, protests led to violence in Jerusalem and criticism from many U.S. allies and the United Nations. Against precedent, the Queen's Museum's building had been used as the backdrop for an announcement of a major shift in U.S. foreign policy. As fall stretched to winter, I could tell that a small group of board members were unhappy with my leadership, particularly around my recommendations that we participate in the arts-based sanctuary initiative and to decline the mission of Israel's event. The job of director is difficult enough without this kind of doubt from the board, and after a grueling year-end, I decided in late January 2018 to resign. It broke my heart to come to this conclusion because I knew I had so much more to contribute to the museum and to its publics. If there were a few board members who did not like what I was determined the museum, there were only a few board members who did not like that I was determined that the museum should take a position on events that deeply impacted our staff and surrounding communities via our operations. I believe that as a culture, and I continue to believe, that as a cultural space reflecting our collective values, that we could not remain neutral, especially as the very foundations of democracy seem to be crumbling around us. Neutrality, in fact, is not at all neutral. Rather, to paraphrase the South African anti-apartheid leader Desmond Tutu, it is a position in and of itself that supports the status quo. And given how the museum had always operated, as well as its commitments to our own staff and collaborators, we knew the realities that confronted us could not be met with indifference. Since my departure from the Queen's Museum, I have been contemplating the history of how museums came to be in the United States and how they operate today, particularly in the ways their modes of storytelling embody specific politics and how we might understand their connection to a whole matrix of power relations and ideologies. Amid calls for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has now become a deafening mantra in the United States, in our spaces of culture, there is no way around a confrontation with neutrality as the persistent ideology within the museum. In a sense, it is the expertise of the museum that makes it trustworthy, that it selects art and makes exhibitions that are educational, that it instructs publics. However, there are many structures, from operations and governance to curatorial choices to the treatment of the staff that undergird these selections and the ways in which they are presented and interpreted by the museum that are directly oppositional to any desire for diversity and inclusion. The problem lies in the fact that these structures are unseen and unregistered, and that they undeniably privilege those of specific class, race, educational, and social backgrounds. If we truly want to undo barriers to so-called inclusion, we must face this false neutrality and dismantle it. There's more to the introduction, but I'm going to go forward now because I want to get to our discussion as well. No, I'm good. Thanks. So this is the neutrality problem. I'd like to map some ways I've thought about neutrality to wrap my mind around what it means more broadly in the larger world outside of cultural institutions. Is the myth of neutrality something that is extant everywhere? Can we get to the bottom of the neutral? To start, what does it mean with respect to journalism? In the age of fake news and Trumpism, maybe this is a way of understanding our realities. And here, writer and critic Rebecca Solnit's thoughts are helpful. Quote, "We tend to treat people on the fringe as ideologues and those in the center as neutral, as though the decision not to own a car is political and the decision to own one is not, as though to support a war is neutral and to oppose it is not." Further, when she and I talked in 2018 as I was beginning research for this book, she told me, quote, "My best journalism professor was Ben Bagdikian, ombudsman for the Washington Post during the Watergate and Pentagon Papers. He had this wonderful line. He said, 'You can't be objective, but you can be fair.' That came just before my immersion in postmodernism, in which there's no neutral position. Bagdikian's approach had a huge influence on me because in journalism, you do pretend to be neutral, like God, and we're not God, and God isn't neutral either. Neither are the goddesses. Fairness and accuracy and honesty are about disclosing where you stand, rather than pretending that you don't have a horse in the race." A staunch leader in the battle to make the problematics of neutrality visible is Latanya Autry, a cultural organizer in the visual arts who is also a curator and an art historian. In 2017, she and Mike Morawski, another art worker and author who until recently held an institutional position as director of learning at the Portland Museum of Art, started a nonprofit organization called #MuseumsAreNotNeutral to put a fine point on the fact that museums are politically, socially, and economically constructed spaces and therefore cannot be neutral. Not only does Autry write regularly on the subject, but she has amassed an invaluable bibliography of resources publicly available as a Google Doc on her website, Art Stuff Matters. And she and Murawski also sell a Museums Are Not Neutral t-shirt, which unites like-minded art workers. And as of August 2020, they had sold over 2,000 shirts, generating over $20,000 in donation to social justice causes. The first time Autry and I met to discuss the subject, she said something potent. Quote, I always go back to reading Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, in which he talks about white moderates as a group most obstructive to racial justice during the civil rights era. Rhetoric like, oh, go slow, you're pushing too fast, is directly parallel to the ways attempts to make change within cultural spaces, as well as in society in general today. People say, don't be an activist, don't be a protester, unquote. This corollary is particularly exasperating given that Dr. King's words were written more than a half century ago in 1963. On another register that relates more specifically to institutional rejections of the impossibility of neutrality, Robert Jensen, in his essay, The Myth of the Neutral Professional, writes, quote, there are issues that can occur if the notion of neutrality in memory institutions does not continually get challenged. For instance, if a memory institution is perceived as being neutral, then actions like adding First Nation stories of oppression to the collection to rectify past imbalances of perspectives can be framed as not an action of balance, but rather as a political act. This could lead memory institutions to avoid necessary actions because they're deemed risky and they don't want to be considered political. In a society of white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy, the institutions of white Western primacy and institutions of white Western primacy, any actively decolonial, pro-Black, pro-Latinx, pro-immigrant, pro-working class, pro-trans, pro-queer, pro-disabled, pro-family by any and all definitions, and self-reflective feminist positions are regarded as political by default. They are perceived as aggressive, defiant, a challenge to the status quo, rather than as facets of reality that are co-equal to the dominant story. Even recognition of the presence of an alternative to the dominant becomes an adversarial act and a challenge to that very dominance. As I was formulating a working web of definitions for neutrality, writer, poet, artist, and cultural critic Wayne Kostenbaum recommended that I read Roland Barthes' annotated lectures delivered as a course at the Collège de France in 1977 and 78 on the neutral. I immediately got a copy. Kostenbaum, via Barthes, challenged me to think of the neutral as another type of space, one that has infinite flexibility, a dimension where meaning remains elastic, full of possibility. Sleep, silence, tact, all are examples of stances that embody this neutrality, and they are indeed full of potential. This vein of thinking runs in direct contradiction to my own sense that a neutral condition is quite literally impossible to achieve. I struggled through the chapters until I came to Barth's description of a shopping spree for colored ink. He writes, quote, I go out to buy some paints, Sennelier inks, bottles of pigment. Following my taste for the names, golden yellow, sky blue, brilliant green, purple, sun yellow, Cartham pink, a rather intense pink, I buy 16 bottles. In putting them away, I knock one over. In sponging up, I make a new mess, a little domestic complication. And now I'm going to give you the official name of the spilled color, a name printed on the small bottle. It was called Neutral. Well, I was both punished and disappointed. Punished because neutral spatters and stains. It's a type of dull black gray. Disappointed because neutral is a color like the others. And for sale. Therefore, neutral is not unmarketable. The unclassifiable is classified. All the more reason for us to go back to the discourse, which at least cannot say what neutral is. Even in this attempt to keep neutral, empty, and full of potential, it becomes a color, an ink that can be spilled, that can make a mess. It seems the neutral isn't nothing, it's something after all. Barthes insists on it as a space of possibility, which is an idea that I wish were true in the context of the museum, but history and daily experience get in my way. Later in the same chapter, another moment, this time the neutral stands in for possibility. Barthes wants neutrality to be a space before meaning, anticipating meaning, and perhaps even prefiguring other realities. He says, this integrally and almost exhaustively nuanced space is the shimmer. I visualize this as some like glittery nighttime space, maybe like the disco ball, that's the shimmer. The neutral is the shimmer, at whose aspect, perhaps whose meaning, is subtly modified according to the angle of the subject's gaze. And what does he mean? He means by the way we see it as individual people, right? And so what is this angle of the subject's gaze? Is it our positionality? Is it the way that we approach the neutral, the ways in which meaning is inflected by our own histories and traumas and experiences and identities? No matter how much one insists on a pre-discursive space, these elements of ourselves are not dissolvable, immaterial, or vacant. Even as babes, we have our ancestors' experiences embedded in our DNA. Black studies scholar Christina Sharp's brilliant book, In the Wake, elegantly weaves her critical theories with the ways in which chattel slavery and the realities of forced migrations across the Middle Passage are epigenetically passed to descendants, whose bodies and minds entwine with their genes every day. She writes, quoting Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, in the wake, the past that is not past reappears, always to rupture the present. The past, or more accurately, pastness, is a position, and thus, in no way can we identify the past as past. This isn't good or bad, it just is. It demands recognition. It means something, and it makes it harder to imagine something before meaning. She goes on to say the following of descendants. You know what, I'm just going to skip a little bit further, just to save a little time, because I want to get to the discussion. If imagining the ways histories are known and how this impacts the present and the future, then it matters from what position those histories are written or passed on. They are inherently biased. And the alternate narrative, threads that Sharp suggests taking up, might contradict, undermine, and rebel against those that are currently imagined, making the present and the future a far more generous and generative space. I think I'll maybe end there, yeah? Thank you. One thing I just want to say is, before we even start, is that so much of the thinking in this book is beholden to actually many people sitting right here in this audience, and from Sophia and Maria and Jana and Jonas and Janneke. And I just want to say that, as with everything in our universe, that, you know, you have to have a name on a book, and so to publish it, you know, these are collective sets of ideas to which I try to give as much breathing space, but then at the end of the day, I wrote the words on the page, so I have to have my name on the cover.
Beautiful. And thank you for the reading. I think we've all seen what a great read the book is, and why we all should buy one and read it with what's left of the little bit of summer that we have here. Yeah, I mean, even from that sort of fragment you gave, especially from the introduction, it's an incredibly inspiring story in terms of all of these initiatives that really flourished in response to a political emergency. It's also an incredibly sobering story in terms of your experience of what you generously called a kerfuffle when you introduced it then. It's kind of a perfect storm of national political crisis of a historical order and this particular governance crisis of one art museum. Nonetheless, on her cover notes, your colleague Aruna D'Souza calls it a love letter to museums. So despite this experience, you're not arguing for an abolition. You're not arguing against museums per se. And I wonder if you'd like to speak to that as an opening.
Yeah, for sure. You know, it's funny because Aruna and I have spent a lot of time talking on this subject, and she's like, "How can you still believe in the museum or the cultural space? And you know, why can't we just throw it out the window?" And I guess, you know, on one level, part of me is like, "Yeah, well, maybe we should do that." But on another level, I think maybe it's my being the daughter of an immigrant, where like nothing gets thrown away and you reuse everything. Maybe that's part of my anxiety about you know, throwing the museum out the window. And in part, it's because of all of the intellectual and cultural and artistic capital, never mind actual financial capital, that has been invested in these spaces, that I think it's sort of, it feels like a waste not to just completely undo it and redo it. I think, obviously, in some ways, that's a heavier lift than, you know, starting from scratch. But by the same token, I think that, you know, that cultural space has always had an element of the civic in it, no matter which context you're in. You know, in the United States, it's visible in very particular ways, and perhaps more, less with the like really famous big museums, but more with the local community centers and smaller museums that are in very particular, you know, neighborhoods, like even like the Queen's Museum, for example, where it's, you know, by certain parts of the population, it's seen as a very civic space and a place for interaction, while it remains highly intimidating to others. So, you know, I think there's that balance between the two, and I just feel like these are structures that can be reutilized, you know. Maybe I spent too much time also reading Donald Judd's writings on architecture, because, you know, he really believes in reusing every scrap you can.
So transformation is the project then, right? Rather than abolition. Well, at least from your experience. So then, of course, the question is tools. Like, what are the tools to do that? And recently, in the States, unionization's a very important agenda. Of course, in Europe, we have a slightly different relation to that. BDS is a very important part of your experience. But from your story, one of the things that comes forward very strongly is that transformation needs to take place at the board, that the board is a really crucial site at which these crises play out. Yeah. And I wonder from your experience what you think the interventions into board structures could be, and how that could help us transform these cultural spaces.
Well, in the US, the board structure is completely tied to money. So, you know, it's just, this is the hardest nut to crack in the US because, of course, philanthropy is the thing that makes US institutions possible. There is no valuable state, there is no state support. There isn't even a Ministry of Culture in the United States. There are only local cultural ministries, like the city of New York has a Department of Cultural Affairs. The largest, the only structural agency devoted to culture in the U.S. that's on the federal level is the National Endowment for the Arts, which has a smaller budget than the city of New York. So, you know, I mean, there's a very limited amount that, you know, the government can do, one way or the other, good or bad, you know. It's not, as you all have experienced here, it's not always a great thing to have, you know, most of your resources coming from the public sector. So my argument has to go to the finances because that's the problem, right? And so the finances of institutions have to be diversified. We have to not be solely supported by either the state or the private sector. We have to have a diversity of sources of funds that includes very many different buckets of funding. And in the United States, what that means is that we have to finally, at some point, have a national conversation about what culture means to the population of the United States. I have no idea how that happens, but I did embark on a project to attempt to begin to understand what people desire from culture. This last year, it was a project that I began when I was a fellow with Hyperallergic, that we collaborated. I initiated a collaboration with the Brooklyn Public Library, which is one of the largest library systems in the U.S. And our friend Jakob Orsas, really wonderful thinker, was my touchstone at the library, and he and curator Cora Fisher and I brought a group of advisors together to really think through how we could ask questions to invite people to envision what they might desire from culture. It was meant for regular people. We were in the midst of a year, well, we didn't know that COVID was coming, but we were going into 2020, which was the year of the census, which happens every decade in the US. And so we determined that we should run a smaller census to find out what people desired from culture. And so we designed a questionnaire, basically, that we initially planned would be carried out and divided over the 63 different branch libraries in physical form, and that people would be asked these questions in physical life. But of course, the pandemic got in the way of that. So we ended up doing it digitally. We still had 4,000 respondents and ran a series of very highly well-attended working groups, and developed a kind of proclamation on art and life that you can find on the Brooklyn Library's website, which is a work in progress. It was never meant to be a finished document because it is an iterative process, and we've been talking about the public radio station we're talking with the public radio station in New York City about having a series of call-in shows to have additional people make commentary and kind of express their interest or their irritation at the proclamation. And the goal of this is to use the results of the survey through a collaboration with a group of planners and wonderful lefty thinkers called Urban Front, which Jana and I are both also involved with, to have them do the analysis of the survey to then deliver to the new mayor who's going to be coming into office in November, to give a sense of really, this is like what New Yorkers want from culture. And to me, this is important, getting back to your question. I will circle back to this, I promise. But this is essential because without having a common sense of what regular folks think about and want from their cultural space, you can't, in the United States, imagine getting public funding. Getting enough public support for public funding to actually make that happen on a federal level. And that is absolutely what is necessary, in my mind, to counterbalance philanthropy as it stands currently, because there is just too much private interest. And frankly, it's both too much and not enough. It's like, the people who are wealthy who make contributions don't quite give enough money to, given the relationship of their contributions to the scale of wealth, right? But also, it comes with, power, giving these funds. And so, if we as a collective public could actually support culture in the US, it would mean something different. There would be a different type of accountability, right? And so, to that point, changing the board, because if you have now board members that are only there, or there primarily for their wealth, right? How do you shift that? And I really believe that actually boards can and should be remade into truly governance and fiduciary boards, where they are about ensuring that the institution is upholding its mission, et cetera, but where you have people who actually know about what it is to run an institution. I mean, when you look at how corporate boards run, for example, first of all, people are paid to be on corporate boards. They're paid and they are there because of what their expertise is. I would love to have like Maria and Sophia on my board so that when things really got fucked up, I could be like, oh my God, what do I do? And this is the thing, like there was nobody on my board at the Queen's Museum who I could call about museum things. They were people who were expert in all kinds of other stuff, but nothing to do with the museum. So when I really had a question, I called a colleague, of course. But it would be different if the people who were guiding the governance and the fiduciary, the financial responsibility of the museum, were themselves experts in the field or adjacent, and had expertise that I could have actually used, as opposed to like, oh, well, this is how I would do that as the owner of the largest used car dealership in all of Queens County. That was not useful to me, even though they were lovely people, I mean.
So the Deneutralization Agenda, which could also be a sort of another title for your book, means almost something like an antitrust movement for museums. It's sort of part of a bigger process of antitrust necessities in terms of breaking down power more broadly.
Yeah, and I think, I think one of the things that has emerged, it's interesting because I handed in the first draft of my manuscript in March of 2020, and then of course the whole world changed in many very profound ways. The precarities and realities that were visible to many of us became visible to many more people as a result of the impacts of the pandemic, and necessarily this came home to cultural space because the inequities of society, wealth gaps and other things. Oh, okay, hi. Sorry, I was hiding behind the plant. But for the people who, sorry, I just lost my train real quick.
Antitrust, but I'm also keen that you mentioned the manuscript because I'm keen to ask.
Yes, so the manuscript. So I handed in the manuscript in March of 2020, and obviously things became very differently visible in that moment, right? And in the United States, at the moment that George Floyd was murdered, and millions of people were on the street protesting in the midst of a pandemic, in very powerful ways. Things changed. And of course, in the desire to express solidarity, many museums put out these statements that were, there was nothing necessarily wrong with the statements as such, but because they didn't necessarily relate to the ways in which those places operated on a day-to-day, they were then became the targets of further protest. And one of my biggest desires in writing this book, and the biggest conclusions that I came to as I kind of lived through the last 18 months and tried to make sense of it in the midst of it to write the last chapter, was to think through, how do we slow down enough? Like the most radical thing we can do right now on one level is to slow down, because decisions are being made too quickly and with not the right people in the room. We must slow down because we have to make sure that we're making, going back to something we were talking about earlier, the consolidation of power to make decisions has become so stilted by capitalism that leadership and individuality trumps everything else. So, the fact that I'm happy to make an executive decision is meaningless if I make a terrible decision, right? And the reality that museums and cultural spaces are profoundly collective endeavors. I mean, even just the planning of this event tonight, how many people did it take? It's not just Vivian and, me sitting up here. It's like a half dozen people doing their things, and the person who did the social media and the person who does the PR. And this is largely invisible. Because in museums, we've bought into this fantasy of the director and chief curator of being the only and most important people. And in point of fact, this is not this is not the reality of who opens the front door every day, who cleans the toilets so that the public can use them. I mean, this is the reality of the operations of a museum. And so while I decidedly applaud institutions that have made great strides in, say, diversifying like who and what is on display within the galleries, this is absolutely meaningless if you're not dealing with the structural inequities and the realities of the operations of the institution. You cannot do one without the other, otherwise it's just tokenism.
So it brings me to one of the questions that the introduction also brings up and your experience in terms of the kinds of responses that arise in a crisis, such as the crisis of the Trump regime, the very exciting mechanisms that came out of it. You started having these all-staff meetings, these entirely new forms of governance. But what you had with that situation is a situation where taking sides became necessitated by this rather exceptional political circumstance, right? Where sort of neutrality was kind of thrown out the window by this radically not neutral political figure, you know. But so what happens once sort of the normal is reasserted, no?
Right.
Like how does an institution continue to have these extraordinary measures such as an all-staff meeting or this very remarkable art sanctuary movement, you know? How is it possible to insist upon that?
Well, and I think this ties also to the demands that are being made that are very powerful by very many aspects of society in the United States, not just protesters, but also sources of funds, foundations, other things to actually address racism within the cultural space, and not just through the exhibition program, right? So the way that, and the only way to do that is to slow things down, to slow the production down, because the institutions have been working on this breakneck speed. I don't know anyone who works in a cultural institution who is not dying of overwork, you know? And so you can't just say, okay, well now we're gonna do the diversity, equity, and inclusion thing on top of it. You can't do that. It's just not possible. It's like no one can withstand this kind of, it's like a hyperactive productivity that doesn't make any sense, right? So one has to understand that in order to break down these like really deeply held things that we have been taught since birth, we have these experiences that have been indelibly implemented into our minds, into the way we act in the world. And so in order to undo that, I mean, we have to spend some time together. We have to sit in discomfort. We have to be able to have conversations that are painful, that are difficult, that are profoundly terrible and good, right? And so in some senses, and this is, you know, Jana and I have talked about this, you know, and her work around the not yet has been extremely influential to me, because in postponing the end, or in focusing on the process, right, and postponing the results or the conclusion, maybe you can get to a space where we can be better together. And I think for me, this is something that is so important. How can we be better together? How can we talk to one another? How can we share space? Or if necessary, maybe I have to leave the room in order for you to be okay. And that's okay too, you know? And this is something, you know, that these are processes that cannot be speedy. This is not fast work. This is slow work, you know? Maybe we need like a slow museum movement, like the slow food movement or something, you know? There's something that we need to, there are, and the cultural space is like a very beautiful civic structure when you think of it, because, you know, it does create a bubble of time in a sense, and you can, you know, give yourself, you know, a moment within a cultural setting to kind of unplug yourself from the rest of this chaos going on outside. At least we're starting to be able to go back into these spaces now. I mean, for a while it was happening on Zoom, and it's funny because there were a few programs that we did when I was at the Leslie Lohman Museum where it generated that space digitally, but it was rare, you know, and it only happened in very particular circumstances. So I'm not sure how that, I mean, I know you can do it digitally because also I have that with people who I love and who live very far away and I never get to visit them. So like we only have the digital space and we can find that intimacy there. But I think it also, there is an embodied necessity as well that we as humans have, as we've all experienced in this pandemic.
I'm having a lot of flashbacks to the renaming process right now that we've had. And indeed, what it really means for an institution to deliver the programs that it needs to deliver, and at the same time to undergo profound transformation. And the fact that these are two workloads that need to happen side by side, and that currently are trying to be juggled within an existing sort of framework. But in terms of slowing down, in terms of different paces of work, please tell us about the writing of this book. So the book kind of gets us to this crisis point, to this departure from a directorship, and then what next? How did you come to write the book, and how did you approach this very personal and sensitive topic?
Well, it was funny because right when I left the museum, I thought, I became obsessed with this idea about neutrality being total bullshit. And so I started talking to everyone I knew about, the neutral. And I was like, oh, this will be fun. I will record conversations I have with colleagues and friends and whatever, anyone who cares to talk to me about this. And I'll make sort of a book of interviews about this subject, kind of, showing the various facets and registers in which people perceive neutrality. And then as I was talking to everyone, I was like, gosh, I actually have a lot to say about this topic that's not necessarily related to it is related to the conversations, but also is much more specifically geared towards the realities of cultural space. And because so many of the conversations led me to think about the history of the evolution of the museum in the United States and how that was both coming from Europe, but also very different from the European context, in terms of collecting, and also in terms of financial structures, that it was important to rehearse that. And so the first chapter in the book talks about the crisis with the Sackler family and their funding of, cultural spaces, but also the OxyContin disaster, which has, been many, many years in unfolding, and only recently resulted in some paltry amount of money that the family has to pay, which is disgusting, but nonetheless, I guess it's gone through the process. But that part of the book is really devoted to getting into the nitty-gritty of, where did the museum come from in the US? And where it came from, in very simple, you should read the book, but in very simple terms, is that, basically the United States looked at Europe and was like, okay, we need to have these things because they're legitimizing, right? And we also want to show off how special, the United States is. And we being not people who look like me, but men, wealthy men, white men of very particular educational backgrounds, who got together and were like, gee whiz, isn't my library so wonderful? And their friend was like, I love your library, and don't you love mine? And I love your library too, because it's the exact same books that are in my library, and let's make a library together. And then it was like, oh, and gee, I also bought this art, and my kids don't give a shit about it and don't want to store it. So, let's make it into a museum. Okay, great, cool. And then, let's give the whole entire collection to a school so that hundreds of students study our brilliant collections year after year after year. And suddenly, the thing that was my personal, very specific view of what was beautiful and wonderful and excellent, and that I was, only exposed to 17 things in my life because I was a colonial American, that's what became excellent. And you suddenly realize that, it's totally ridiculous that there's this very narrow group of objects that become the thing that is excellent, right? And so entire institutions are built around the excellence of that particular work, and entire careers are built around writing about how wonderful that particular work is. But can you imagine the entire universes that were left out of the collector's experience that are not reflected there? And what do you do with that, So the narrowness, I think, becomes very clear. And, the problematics of even talking about a museum like the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a universal museum. I mean, what the hell is universal about the Met? The fact that stuff is stolen from a lot of different places across the globe, that's the universal quality? I mean, come on. So, I like to use, there's one example that I sort of like to use because it brings it home a little bit, like where the universality ends is like when you become excluded from, when you see yourself as excluded from that group, right? So like, for example, if you are originally from Nigeria and go to France, and you suddenly see a room full of mini bronzes, you know, you're like, okay, I could never see these where I grew up, but I can see them here. And this is the legacy of colonialism. This is like profoundly fucked. So, you know, the universality ends where you realize that you yourself are excluded from it. You know, and it's a lovely idea that we're all one big happy human family, but the reality is that we are all beautifully different and have extremely different life experiences, and we need to honor that.
So we're going to go to questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask sort of one more question just before we go there, and it's kind of a tricky one. It's a curveball, but I'm really interested to know. I mean, this decision to resign, as you said, was a very difficult one, and one that I'm sure there were many factors playing in it. And it's one that I find, I guess, inspiring and admirable to do. It's also one that it seems that women take more than others. Helen Moll's work would be another good example.
Well, she was actually fired.
She was fired, but there are others,
yeah.
But I just wonder, is there one factor that would have made a decision different, that would have led you to sort of stick it out?
If the board members who had been who had been for me, had the backbone to stand up and say, you know, no, you can't treat her like this. This is wrong. If I also knew that in terms of my own, it's interesting because in the aftermath, I had a number of different people ask me why the staff didn't then also quit and, you know, other things. And I said, look, you know, I knew that first of all, you know, I would have health care even if I quit because my husband had a job that had health care for my family. And so I wasn't giving up health care. Which of course is one of the most ridiculous things about being a United States, living in the United States, is that your healthcare is completely linked to your work, and so this is why unionization is imperative, and why the work of unions within the cultural sphere make a great deal of sense. But I felt like I could do it. It was like viable for me to do it and to make a statement out of it. And in point of fact, I had way more power once I resigned than I did before, because people wanted to know why, and people wanted to have the discussion. And so in a way, if I had just stayed and suffered and soldiered on, I would have actually been muted by the system that was trying to mute me in the first place. And so the only thing that I could do, actually, to have a voice, was to resign. It was really, you know, I felt like I had so much to do, but I couldn't do it under the circumstances that were being dealt to me. So I just said, no, I just cannot. I think that's the answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Which raises a relationship between curatorship and journalism that sort of comes up in your Neutrality chapter, but we might begin to throw to the audience if anyone has questions. Oh, don't be shy.
Thank you so very much, and congratulations to the book. Cannot wait to read. You mentioned libraries on a couple of occasions, and indeed Brooklyn libraries and remarkable work. But if you look at the literature on how to build equitable infrastructure, Eric Klinenberg, for example, the People's Palaces. There's one type of institutions, culture institutions, only one type of culture institutions that figures within this infrastructure. It's the library, so it's never a museum, it's a library. And I wonder, from the perspective of your subject, neutrality and governance, what did they get right?
Well, so libraries are weird in the US because basically Carnegie, one of the major robber barons, made libraries possible throughout the United States. He literally paid for libraries to be constructed in every town across the United States. So the source of the public library in the US is very strange, or not strange, it's obviously very predictable, but it comes straight out of capitalism. And the reason that Carnegie did this was that he grew up a very, very poor child and somehow became a bajillionaire. So, you know, he was grateful for this and decided that that his money should be used to this end. I think part of it is actually just in that we still call them public libraries. I mean, the idea that it's public, right, comes from the name. And even though libraries, as in terms of like their internal corporate structures, let's just say, they're nearly identical to museums in the US. They have patrons, they have boards, they have all of this stuff. However, the fact that this word public still stays, it's still called the Brooklyn Public Library, the Queens Public Library, the New York Public Library. It's not called the Carnegie Library of New York, you know? It removes the philanthropist from the public. And this is like a weird barrier that for some reason exists. Because like, for example, the New York Public Library, the main branch on 42nd Street, the building is called the Schwartzman Building for this rather horrible human who gave a shit ton of money to make it the Schwartzman Building. But nobody thinks about it as a Schwartzman Building. People think about it as the New York Public Library. So that mental shift, I think, is one thing. I think another thing is that the accessibility of branches in New York City, basically between Brooklyn and Queens, probably within a mile of every single residence, there is a library branch. It's very common to have a library. And many people send their kids to libraries after school for, you know, it's kind of like childcare for older kids. You know, the kids walk from the school to the library because there's no childcare in the US either. So, you know, if you have two working parents and or one working parent and the child has to go somewhere after school, you know, can't stay at school. So the library becomes the place. It's a place where people feel they can enter. And part of it is because I think you can take the things out. You can take the objects of the library out and home with you. You're entrusted with it. It's a book. It's just a book. You take it out, you bring it home. I think there's like part of it that you can feel and touch. I also think that libraries, particularly in the US, and I haven't studied the libraries here, for example, or in Europe more broadly, but they've started all these other programs that you can take stuff. So for example, like, you know, they have, of course, kind of programs where they help you develop your resume, for example. And if you need clothes, like a tie or something that's, you know, kind of required for a job interview, they will provide a tie. Many libraries have tie archives, like where you can get a tie just like you would borrow a book. But they also have relationships with, particularly for unhoused women, they have relationships with nonprofits that provide working clothes for unhoused women. And so if you're looking, they can connect you with the organization. So they act as this kind of bridge to different kinds of social services that are really helpful to people. And so people see it, and also like you can be an unhoused person and walk into, I remember when I was visiting the head of the Queens Public Library, and there was a group of unhoused men who came to the library every day and just sat and read or slept in the chairs or whatever, and that was just fine. And it was not a problem. And so it was truly a public space. It reflected its name in that way. And so to me, these are like the differences. The threshold is, and there is a power in keeping the name. So like even in my neighborhood where I live in Chelsea, like the local library is the Muhlenberg branch, but I don't think anybody knows that that's what it's called. They just think it's the library. So
also,
like,
also the Institute of Museums and Library in the United States considers, meaning libraries compete with museums for funding.
Yes.
For public funding, I mean. They're not, of course there's literature departments, but for initiatives and special projects, the IMLS, which is a major funding institution, does not see a distinction between a museum or a library.
And that, in fact, is super interesting because the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, gives away somewhat quietly far more money
than the
NEA. and
Public money.
has managed to not be politicized, weirdly. But I think it's also because it includes libraries.
Yeah.
Because it's like library services, right?
Yeah.
Strange.
The service-oriented museum, what could it be? I don't know where the mic is. Okay, right, next.
Yeah. My question is, you told us that your museum worked together with the community organizing, and I wanted to ask, do you think is it a chance for museums to overcome the wrong neutrality, to work together with community organizing, or what kind of role did that play?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important kind of subtlety, because I think you know, a lot of museums talk about outreach, right? Like reaching out into communities, quote unquote. And I think the outreach is clearly to get people who don't come to the museum to come to the museum. But the intention of this community organizing program was completely the opposite. It was to say to local groups, whether they were, you know, activist groups or local cultural institutions that had, you know, very small footprints or whatever, what is it that the Queen's Museum, as kind of the big fish, can provide to you? How can we help? Is it just by lending you chairs and a PA system whenever you need it? Or is it by, you know, providing you access to the art therapist, you know, that's on staff? Or is it, you know, it was really like, it was a very open and, you know, sincere invitation to say, are there ways that we can support your work, right? Rather than the other way around. And I think that to me, this is a profound repositioning of the communication model of the museum, because for the most part, cultural institutions and museums are broadcasting. They're like giving out information constantly. It's constantly like, here, come in, listen to what we have to say. We have some beautiful, beautiful things to tell you about, you know, which is true. But also, what about hearing from people what they know? You know, what about recalibrating the ways in which we imagine the knowledges of our publics? And how about thinking about an interaction with public not as just receiving the knowledge of the institution, but rather as an exchange? So I think part of what the desired intent with relationship to community organizing piece is to say, how about, you know, is there something that we can provide, you know, knowing that there is knowledge from the communities that surround the museum that should be informing the work of the museum itself, right? That there is really deep and powerful knowledge in those spaces that the museum does not have access to. And so is there a way that we can provide support by whatever definition the community organizations might have to learn from them? You know, and for it to be done in not in and the reason that it's community organizing is that it's the explicit way of doing it is to be non-exploitative. I mean, I think so much of those interactions become, you know, develop exploitative relationships, but how can those relationships not simply exploit people once again?
Yeah. Can I ask a question? Yeah.
Sit down? Yeah. I wanted to go a little bit to the part of the book of In the Age of Protest and leave the museums just for a second, because I think that one of the things that certainly has happened in the last couple of years is that art spaces or cultural spaces that are not necessarily museums or collecting institutions have also taken much more a center stage in terms of the production of culture and the production of meaning, which is ultimately why we're interested in museums, right? How can we produce meaning, and not just from the art objects that have been done in the past or the ideas and cultures, but to change value systems that could be much more adaptable through time and not just creating canons or such. But I want to go to the part of protest in the book, and which I'm very interested in reading. I think that this will be my weekend reading. but specifically because in the last year we have seen so many protests, and I know that you deal with some of them within the book. To me, one of the, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement and the way in which it became a global movement and impacted really the reconsideration of infrastructure and structural systemic problems, and not just influence symbolic or content-oriented activities, is of course very influential. And I would say that the one that preceded it and that has continued, that has been in the last couple of years to me one of the most exciting ones, is the power that Nan Goldin had in, or the way in which she as an artist used the visibility and power that that visibility could command simply as an artist to mobilize and to change institutions. So I don't know if you're aware, are you aware of the Nan Goldin's campaign? Just for those that are not, she has been, first of all, she's one of the most interesting artists in the United States. For some time now, she must be in her early 60s, maybe late 50s. I don't know, late 50s?
Maybe a little older though.
Okay, 60s somewhere? Mid-60s. And she has been known for photography. In fact, I just heard that a Birch was publishing for the 20th time. Now her very famous photo book, like various years ago, in which she is pretty much hanging out with her friends, of which most of them are junkies. This is in 1980s New York City. Most of them are junkies. Nightlife is a big thing, and trans sex, like the whole thing it's nightlife New York, 1980s. You couldn't expect more decadence than what is displayed there. Her work has been very much known because of the beauty that and the affection that the images convey, regardless of the conditions and precarity that they're figuring. But ultimately, her demonstrations and her campaigns against the Sackler Family, which are the pharmaceutical, they're the owners of the pharmaceutical that produce opioids, right? Really brought down a family that had been in court for over a decade in many different states within the United States, and that it was not, of course, slowly the cases have been growing, but really the visibility mediatically that Nan Goldin brought to these cases was a way for me to see how artists have had the power, for example, this one, to accelerate a process or to revive and activate a process precisely that needs to be questioned by society at large. So I wanted to see the way in which you have thought of demonstrations or protests like the one of Nan Goldin, that is not about necessarily just, it's about changing the pharmaceutical system, but doing it through the arts precisely because these are the trustees that finance institutions internationally. And that their name is common not because of pharmaceutical, but because of the arts.
The arts.
Yeah.
And I think the significant piece about the Nan Goldin situation was that the first crack in the facade of the Sackler situation was when the National Portrait Gallery in London wanted to do the show with her, and she said, not if you have that fucking name on the wall. And they said, okay, we'll take off the name. And that was the first crack, and then the Louvre, and then, so it's very interesting, that kind of power, but of course, as you say, Nan Goldin, one of the most important artists in the United States, certainly part of like every collection out there. I think the way that artists can use their power is really different depending on their status and the ways in which they're collected, etc. Another interesting example, which I also talk about in the book, I talk a great deal about Nan Goldin, but also about the notorious Warren Kanders, who was on the board of the Whitney, and who manufactured tear gas that was used against asylum seekers during the Trump administration, against protesters in Ferguson and also in Palestine. And the reality of that process is also interesting, because the change never would have happened without a whole variety of registers of protest. And so you had a writer for Hyperallergic that broke the story, a group of 100 staff members at the Whitney who wrote a letter to the director that was never meant to be public, but then became public. Then the media storm around that, then the director's response, which was, Adam Weinberg is a longtime friend of mine, but he knows I disagree with him strongly on the way that he responded to the protesters, basically, to the staff, basically telling them that it's none of their business to stay in their lane, which was very depressing because they were questioning how they could do their work with the values that they understood to be the values of the museum if such a person was allowed to be on the board, But the real, and then of course the external protests from Decolonize This Place and weekly protests that were happening, in the lobby of the museum, et cetera, but the real tipping point came at the very end of, in the middle of the biennial, which was dubbed the Tear Gas Biennial, and there were works in the exhibition that were exposés about Warren Kanders by Laura Poitras and Forensic Architecture. Incredibly powerful work situated within the biennial to be disrupted to that purpose. But the thing that was really the tipping point was a group of artists who demanded their works be withdrawn in the middle of the exhibition, including Nicole Eisenman, who had won the Buxbaum Award, which is the award that's given at every biennial, and whose sculpture was incredibly big, incredibly complicated, and incredibly expensive, and difficult to remove. And so, the fact that this group of artists specifically used their cultural capital at that moment was the tipping point. And that's when Kanders resigned. But it would not have happened, I think in that case, it would not have happened. If they had done that at the outset, it wouldn't have happened. It needed all of these rather uncoordinated, situations to get to that point. And what I think, and one of the other conclusions that I kind of make in addition to slowing down that I think is like super essential is also that for those of us who function within institutions, the necessity to imagine, to shift our imaginations, to think about protest as a radical form of care is essential. Without shifting, because I know what it's like to be protested, right? Like when you're in an institution and people are protesting, you're like, oh, but we're trying, we're like the good guys, and we're like trying to work it out. But the reality is that those people would not be protesting if they didn't care to some degree about that space. And so when you look at it with that lens, you understand that this conversation is a gift. Even if people are shouting at you, it's still a gift. And you have to take it as a gift, and you have to interpret it as a gift, and you have to analyze it as a gift. And I think that part of this way that we need to learn how to be better together comes through doing that, comes through taking the kind of defensiveness out that is so natural. And when you say, oh my God, no, but it's so natural, but we have to kind of interrupt ourselves in that way of thinking, because otherwise we can't get to what is going on. So, even for example, in the unionization, we were talking about the unionization efforts of the new museum. The idea that the new museum, which was founded by Marcia Tucker, with these completely radical forms of self-governance within the staff, where people rotated responsibilities and positions every month, like the craziness of that, to imagine a place like the new museum hiring a union-busting corporate firm to make sure that the union never got off the ground is insane. It's insane. How do you not say, as with the DNA of the new museum, how do you not walk into the room with the people who are organizing the union and say, fan-fucking-tastic, let's talk this through, let's figure it out. I want you to advocate for that. I'm the director. What do I know? I don't know what people need. Tell me what people need. I want to know. I want to know what people want. I want to know how they want it. Let's remake it. This is like, why not? The idea that, of course, there are reasons for the way people do things, but there is no reason at this moment of international global precarity and like complete upending, that we cannot reinvent absolutely everything. And this is like where maybe I'm a little bit naive, but my glass is always half full. And so that's what I believe, is that we can always remake it, and we must.
I have another question, also around the aspect of protest.
Yeah.
And is the place within your book, or within your thinking in general, about what has been named cancel culture?
Okay.
The way in which protest has been happening through social media, not just because of how it's accelerated or how it's communicated, but specifically the tactics around shame, and ultimately, again, in the broader sense, cancel culture as a form of protest. And there's been a lot of, back and forth around it, but I wanted to hear you speak about this, again, not as a message or as a distribution channel, but as a form of protest.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think about it a little bit in terms of deplatforming, because I think of it as an extreme way of attempting to deplatform somebody who has traditionally held power. And I guess my attitude around deplatforming is that one has to deplatform certain people. And I'm sorry if I'm speaking in code, like there's this whole, in the realm of freedom of speech, people expect you to debate even the most heinous conversations. And so when you choose to deplatform, you just say, no, look, this person doesn't deserve the platform. Like, I don't care what, free speech or no free speech. I'm not allowing a fascist to come into my museum and give a talk, like whatever. That's just where I draw the line. And that's obviously not neutral, but I think that's okay. Cancel culture, I think, has like a certain parallel to this, because I think like there is a desire to deplatform people who say things that are wrong, right? Or it's deemed to be somehow incorrect. I mean, frankly, I don't know. I feel like I would rather there exists cancel culture than there exists no space to say no. I think it's a pretty terrible place to be. I mean, I once used somebody's incorrect pronoun in a talk, and it was terrible. I will never do that again, let me tell you. So, I'm not sure that I was like somewhat targeted in this kind of cancel culture kind of way, but and it was miserable for, the time, but I think it actually, it served me to understand how my own biases function. In fact, I'm actually writing an essay about, not about cancel culture particularly, but about making mistakes and how we own mistakes and how we are accountable to both ourselves and the people who surround us, and how complicated that is right now, but how important it is to actually to own up to making errors, because we all make errors. This isn't, we're not perfect people, none of us, and so there are things that we do and say that are going to impinge on other people's sense of safety, and and so we have to learn how to confront that. I think that the anger, for example, that was leveled at me was somewhat unfair? I do, but at the same time, maybe it doesn't matter.
In terms of language, you operationalize the term neutrality a lot, and it sort of becomes the core of your argument. And of course, your project broadly could be called deneutralization. And I wonder how that sits alongside broader movements towards decolonization. It feels like there's a parallel in terms of what it means to actually unmask a status quo that's profoundly asymmetric.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I think decolonization as a phrase has been used so much that in a whole variety of different ways that somehow it's hard to grasp. It's like a very slippery idea. You know, I think, you know, I was in Australia 6 months before that, or 3 months before the pandemic.
It's not why I asked the question, but
No,
to bring the Australian examples out. But they're great, by the way.
It was really very influential to me because at the moment that I was in Australia, I had been seeing in the US land acknowledgements become highly popularized around kind of stating the you know, the original stewards of the land and acknowledging that and acknowledging the coloniality. And to me it was challenging because I felt that some of the organizations who were doing this were doing it simply to virtue signal, to be like, hey, I'm cool, I'm down, whatever. You know, it wasn't really about dedicating any kind of space within the institution to issues of indigeneity, of confronting the colonial histories of the institution and of the land that you were actually sitting on. And so to me, it felt very, like, it felt fake, you know. For certain institutions, absolutely not. You know, the Vera Center for Art and Politics, with whom I've collaborated, they have done extensive programming around indigeneity. They're really remarkable for that, but most of their institutions don't go that deep, you know. So in any case, when I was in Australia, you know, which it was bizarrely familiar and yet completely different, you know. It was like the parallels in history between the United States and Australia are super interesting. And as an American being there, everything felt like totally familiar, but like completely weird at the same time, you know. And anyway, I was talking to an Indigenous curator about her work, and I said, you know, honestly, I'm like super conflicted about these, you know, land acknowledgements that are getting spewed out all the time. They feel so canned, it feels very, you know, kind of weird. And she said, she's like, we have to have them. We must have them. It is like the bare fucking minimum. I mean, at least when you're doing a land acknowledgement, you acknowledge that its land has been stolen, you know? Like, that is the bare minimum. And what was interesting as I tuned into the ways in which land was being acknowledged across my visits to a couple of different cities in Australia, was that it became far more personal. You know, in some institutions, it was this totally canned, like, we are sitting on this land and these are the people and da da da. It was very, you know, kind of felt like the PR office wrote it. But as I traveled through more, you know, alternative spaces, people were much more personal about it. It was just like, you know, and I really took a cue from that. It was like, well, actually, think about the fact that you're sitting, you know, as I was for much of the pandemic, sitting on Lenape land in New York, and like, what does it mean to sit on and, you know, actually to be an owner of an apartment that in a building that sits on Lenape land? Like, what does that actually mean? What is this participation? And so now whenever I do a land acknowledgement, I try to incorporate like my own personal feelings about it, because I think that that's the only way, you know, these kind of rote things don't really get to it. So this is a long way of coming to your answer, but decolonization to me has become in some ways the very rote land acknowledgement that pops up on the screen on the website or whatever. But that's necessary. Even though it seems totally friggin' lame, it's necessary because it's the bare minimum. And so in a way, kind of to address decolonization is the bare minimum, as in this kind of very pat way. But again, you know, as with the kind of, I think it requires time. I mean, what can we do? We can't just incorporate entirely new ways of functioning without devoting a serious amount of time to it.
Mm-hmm. And so it seems as though, I mean, to bring back Nan Goldwyn, we're talking about dependency. You know, her famous work, The Ballad of Dependency, but this slowing down also permits neutrality to be disinterred in terms of really asking the question of what are these institutions dependent to, materially, and what would it mean for them to be differently dependent, not independent, differently dependent. Yeah.
That's right, not independent. And I think, you know, if there's one thing that's become enormously poignant over the last 18 months is how dependent we are on all of our, you know, on each other, and each of our escalations is, you know, potentially deadly. So there you go. I mean, how could we possibly be more dependent?
A further question.
Oh, there's a question?
Yes.
Oh,
hi. No worries. Thank you for coming. I ordered your book directly when you shared it. I never got it. It's not your fault. It's Verso's fault. But I'm happy now to hear the first.
But I'll email that. You tell me your name. I'll be like, send her the book.
I have a question because I guess I come from a bit of a different perspective of starting point. We started to create our own cultural institutes, and it started actually from politics and art. And we focus on like diaspora from the Havana region. But now being the director of that space, I also noticed that, being obviously like a refugee or being someone from exile, so on, it's not something, you know, just a topic to engage with. It's true pain, and especially with this whole discussion of that now institutes should become also a safer space. I feel that there's this huge need to be almost like a vacuum in this whole world that becomes super political, and all the identities within that become super political. And actually now what they mostly give back to me is that they just want to be. They don't want to talk about politics because it triggers them a lot. So I'm quite struggling sometimes about how to design that, and also this constant question of, you know, that safer space, and also obviously when people feel really safe, then traumas comes up, and then these conflicts are coming up, and then kind of how to deal with that, because, you know, like for example me, I'm not a social worker, but I do have to deal with all that pain, and it comes to definitely in this time. Also when you mentioned that we have to slow down, it kind of reminded me something with this mindfuck on Instagram, where it's constantly asking you to engage with, you know, let's say what is happening in Afghanistan, to the state position in the situation in Palestine, and at the same time reading like how to deal with guilt, how to deal with shame, and then they say like, yeah, but you should also take care of your mental health, and I'm like, okay, but how to? So I was wondering what your experience is on that.
Yeah, it's an amazing question. I mean, look, I think, well, let me just share so the two things that people most wanted from cultural spaces from the survey that we did was to see themselves reflected and to be taken out of their world, right? To like, two diametrically opposed things. But I think this is the reality of where we all are. We want to see ourselves and our lives and our conditions reflected in our cultural spaces to find meaning there. But we also want to find escape. We also want to find this other magical realm, right? And I think it's the kind of interplay between those two kinds of experiences that is important to somehow balance. You know, there's no magic formula, right? And I think in a sense, you know, I mean, this is what I meant also about, you know, kind of being able to sit in places of discomfort, but also, you know, as Jana has talked about a lot in her work, particularly in Philadelphia, where, you know, the place might not be safe, you know, for everybody who's in the room. And how do we actually contend with that? You know, safety is relative, and, you know, sanctuary is relative. And so, you know, these are not, once again, the universal fails. Because for it to be safe for you, it might mean that I have to leave, or everyone has to leave besides you, you know? So these are conundrums, but I think, like, you know, I think I admire what you're doing. I think it's really like a very important thing that you've started your own institution, and I think it's very brave because it's not an easy time to do that. It's never an easy time, but especially now. But I think that, you know, in this moment, we can only attempt, you know, and so, like, I applaud you for making an attempt to create this space, whether it's safe or unsafe. It's going to change over time, and day by day, even. And I think that we have to be open to these mutations. You know, we're not always making a space that's safe.
Any further questions? I might just take a minute, and otherwise we might turn to... Yeah.
I can also move about...
For the video recording, it's much better if you
Sorry. I had a chance to read the book. It's I profoundly enjoyed it, especially the deepening of the notion of neutrality and the way that you equal it or consider it as a term that naturalizes dominant structures of power, a dominant hegemony. And I was wondering, now that I was listening to you, I was wondering, are there also moments in which the use of neutrality can have a strategic benefit when you are not in the power to enforce an egalitarian hegemony?
Yes.
So I was thinking of the example you were giving about Pence, because the moment that you responded to why can Pence not have his speech, your argument was, well, we don't do that kind of thing in a way you use the card. We're not a political institution, we do weddings, we do bar mitzvahs and whatnot. But let's say that it was Ilhan Omar, or Black Lives Matter organizer, or a progressive voice from the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm sure you would not have used that same argument. So there is, in the condition in which we are, in which egalitarian politics is not the normal, let's say, a normal that allows for hybridity and contradiction and difference, we are positioned sometimes, like progressive lawyers, for example, who adhere to the right to self-determination, will sometimes use the notion of human rights, even though that's fundamentally opposed to where they come from or what their work is about. So I was wondering how you...
Yeah, that was a good catch, Jonas. I think that this is, the instrumentalization of neutrality works because people still believe in it, right? And so one of the examples that I give in the book about how that functions is by a collective artistic effort called Not an Alternative. And they have a project called Natural History Museum, where they instrumentalize people's desire to, belief in science, basically, as a way to challenge the status quo. And in fact, through a major campaign, they actually were incredibly successful in wedging the Koch brothers off of the board of the Museum of Natural History. And this was, considered to be like something completely undoable, And part of what it was through a letter writing campaign that they did with scientists, with people. They realized that nobody knows. Everybody imagines that like scientists are like in some lab somewhere, but like nobody knows what they look like. They just sort of think back to like cartoon characters of like the mad scientist in the lab. So they actually got them on the street. They went to a major scientific convention in Boston. They got all of the scientists to wear white lab coats, where most of them never wore a white lab coat in their life. But to have this like visualization of what a scientist is, to have all these different people with their white lab coats carrying signs about how important science is, actual science, not fake science, real science. And it was the protest was like in every newspaper across the globe. It was an insane amount of coverage for this like relatively small protest, but it articulated something very important, which was that there were people who were anti-science who were sitting on the boards of natural history museums. And so how could you do that? How could you have somebody who did not believe in science on the board of a museum? Or somebody like the Koch brothers, who I don't know what they believe in, they just believe in money, I think. But well, they're both dead, I think, now, so whatever. But they were funding all kinds of evolution theories and think tanks that were promoting evolution as truth. Not evolution. What is it called? Creationism as truth. So they were not, they were on the board, the two of them were on the board of half of the natural history museums in the United States promoting an agenda of creationism, I mean, it's so untenable, you know, this position. And so but now an alternative, by creating a museum, right? And Becca Economopoulos was the director of the museum, and she went to all the conferences as the director. In fact, when I worked at the Queen's Museum, we had a small presentation by them where we had a museum within a museum, which was actually an artwork, but also a museum. And they function by going to these kinds of fairs, essentially, that science museums have, and creating booths that talked about climate emergency and climate crisis. And anyway, brilliant project. I talk about it in the book. It's like, but they use the cloak of the neutrality of the museum as the lever to get into the space where they could then affect change, right? So there is a cloak and dagger aspect to the way that neutrality can be instrumentalized because people still believe in it.
Great question, great questions. All of them. And so I think the final thing we have to ask you is what's next? I mean, of course, shout out to our collaborator Proto Cinema in Istanbul, who will be hosting your next publication launch, and enormous congratulations on the publication. I hope it finds a huge readership. But what are you up to at the moment? What's next for you in this continuing process?
So I continue to work on the art and society census, of course. That's kind of ongoing. And I'm also working on a very unusual research project that involves an exhibition that Peggy Guggenheim organized in 1943 called 31 Women. And I'm trying to locate all of the works that were in that show to talk about the relationships and networks that enabled people to survive this incredibly precarious moment between the United States coming out of the Depression and also in the middle of the Second World War. So stay tuned. That's a weird one, but it's there. And then I'm also working on a burgeoning project with Proto Cinema, which can't be public yet, but perhaps will be soon. And avoiding working for an institution like the Plague. Hey.
Well, it's a real pleasure to host you at this institution, which I can assure you is a pleasure to work in. And on that note, I'd like to thank our colleagues this evening, Lynn Kramer, Moran Hems, Jeroen Lavin, and Iona Tomici, who've all arranged the hospitality and the technical support for us. Please stay tuned and perhaps consider joining us next week, when we'll be hosting a keynote by Michelle Terran as well. And now we'll conclude the evening. Thanks everyone online, and here we will be having a service of refreshments. And you can buy the book either here tonight or come to our library where we have plenty in stock. So thank you for the evening, and thank you, Laura. It's a delight to host you here, all the way from America, our very first cross-Atlantic guest.
And thank you for allowing me to have my very first live book launch. I'm so happy to be here with you all.
Yay. So we don't have an alcohol permit, as you may know already, but there is non-alcoholic beer. In the meantime, no? That we ever get the